Hello, everyone. I'm Olenka Kacperczyk, Associate Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at London Business School. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar series, which are co-hosted by the Center for Corporate Governance and the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. So before we get started, let me just say a few words about our hosts and our speakers today. So the Wheeler Institute has been founded by Tony and Maureen Wheeler, the founders of Lonely Planet. And at LBS, the Institute focuses on supporting cutting-edge research on the role of business in addressing social and economic challenges in emerging and low-income countries. Now, besides funding research and informing learning, the Wheeler Institute also organizes public talks and events. And today's event is the last of the public talks of 2020. Now, the Center for Corporate Governance has similar goals of using rigorous research to influence the practice of corporate governance, which is a highly topical area pertaining to issues associated with responsible business, executive pay, or investor stewardship. And the center regularly engages with investors, board members, company executives, and policymakers, bringing together the best of academic and practitioner thinking. So welcome. And today we're extremely fortunate to have with us Alex Edmans and Andrew Hill. Alex is a professor of finance at London Business School and academic director of the Center for Corporate Governance. Alex is also known for conducting extensive and really impactful research on various topics in responsible business, corporate governance, and executive compensation. His research has been broadly published in economic and finance journals and widely recognized with many academic and practitioners awards. And his recent book in particular, How to Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, made it to the Financial Times Best Business Books of 2020. In his book, Alex raises critical questions regarding the purpose of business and corporations, what it means, how it should be defined, and whether and when firms face a trade-off between their purpose and profit. And clearly, in these difficult times of global pandemics, when companies are strapped for cash, when new fledgling ventures, as well as large all incumbents, becomes extremely frail, questions around corporate purpose couldn't be more timely or more relevant. And so today, Alex will discuss some of these questions in conversations with Andrew Hill, who is the associate editor and management editor of the Financial Times. He joined the FT in 1988. And since then, he had a tremendous impact on the world of practice, his efforts and achievements being widely recognized through the Decade of Excellence Award or the Business Commentator of the Year recognition. And so in just a minute from now, Alex and Andrew will critically examine the case for purposeful business using rigorous research and real-life examples. And my hope is that through these conversations, we can get some insight into what kind of practices work in advancing both corporate purpose and profit. And then finally, I hope we'll get a deeper sense of just how we can play our part too, perhaps as investors or citizens more generally, how we can put purpose into practice in a more effective way. So before we jump in, just a few ground rules. So first, Alex will make the case for purposeful business for about 10 minutes. This will be then followed by the discussion between Alex and Andrew. And then finally, at the end, we'll have the Q&A with the audience, which will be moderated by Andrew. So please use the chat function to submit your questions throughout the session. So you can start right from the beginning. And if you tell us your name and affiliation, then we'll try to mention those as well. So, okay, without further ado, Alex, it's a pleasure, welcome, and thank you again.
Well, thanks so much, Alenka, for hosting, and thank you to the Wheeler Institute for partnering with us, and also to Andrew for moderating. So what I'm going to talk about is what I mean by purposeful business, and this might be somewhat different to what we typically hear. So let me share my screen and talk you through a story, an example from a while ago. So I'd like to take your mind back all the way to 1978. And this is a scientist called William Campbell. He worked for Merck, and he had what seemed to be a crazy idea. So Merck had this drug called ivermectin, which currently was curing parasites in livestock. And he thought, well, there's this possibility that maybe it could cure onchocerciasis in humans. So you might think, well, what is onchocerciasis? Well, this was a really cruel disease. So it was a disease that was transmitted by the female black fly, which used to fly around the riverbanks in Latin America and Africa. And if there was a bite from this black fly, it injected some larvae into you, and these grew into worms, and these worms could be up to 2 feet long. And these worms would crawl underneath your skin, and for some citizens, this was so painful that the only way to get out of the itching and the pain was to commit suicide. So this disease did lead to some people unfortunately taking their own lives. And for those who survived, sometimes and often actually, the worm would crawl up to the head and it would cause river blindness. And so that was the common name for onchocerciasis, river blindness. And this was something which was just seen as a way of life in many developing countries. So once somebody turned in their late 20s or early 30s, they would just naturally go blind. It was just part of growing up, something that people expected to be part of turning into an adult. So this was a really severe illness, and even more of a concern was that it affected some of the poorest countries around the world. So nearly 300 million people were at risk of contracting river blindness. And these were people who lived in houses which were caked together from mud. They wore skirts woven from grass. So if you were Merck at the time, would you ever even bother to develop to try to develop this drug for river blindness? Not only was there a huge low odds of succeeding, because drugs typically didn't succeed across species, but even if it did succeed, would they be able to monetize it when it was a disease suffered by some of the poorest citizens in the world? So if you were a company which was maximizing shareholder value, even long-term shareholder value, you might focus on some conditions which were affecting more the people in the developed world. But that was actually not what Merck was about. It had a purpose, and its purpose was about preserving human life. They didn't really concern themselves so much with whether the people affected by river blindness would ever be able to pay for a treatment. So it took another scientist, Mohammed Aziz, who decided to launch some tests on this new drug for river blindness. And those tests worked, and those tests worked so well that the World Health Organization thought that the data must be wrong. So it showed that in Senegal in 1981, that this disease cured river blindness, and it also didn't have the many side effects that you typically have with anti-parasitic medicine. So they kept on repeating more and more tests, and by 1987, Merck was approved to use ivermectin for humans. But there was one additional problem, and that problem was money. So who would pay for it? Why? Because again, as I mentioned, this was something which affected the poorest people in the world, and the governments could not pay for this drug. So what did Roy Vagelos, the CEO of Merck, decide to do? Well, he tried to look for many other sources of funding. He looked for the US Department of International Development. He looked at the US State Department. He looked at the equivalent of philanthropic foundations. But all of these sources of money, they said no to. But then Roy realized that there was one final source of money that he hadn't tried. And that source was Merck itself. So in 1987, he launched this crazy scheme at the time. It was called the Mectizan Donation Program, where Merck just funded the drug. This was not selling at cost. This was selling for nothing. So he launched the Mectazan donation program in October 1987, which said, we will give as much as needed for as long as needed of this drug to anyone, anywhere in the world that needed it. And this is a drug donation program that still exists today. It's the longest running disease-specific donation program that exists. And to date, there have been 2.7 billion treatments given. It currently reaches 300 million people around the world per year. And currently it's had a huge impact. So there's 4 countries where the World Health Organization has certified it as having completely eliminated river blindness. And in many other countries, while there's not been complete elimination, this has been something where they significantly reduced the incidences of what was an extremely cruel disease. Now, this might seem wishful thinking because clearly pharmaceuticals companies need to also make money. Without money, they can't invest in developing the drugs of the future. But the interesting coda to this was that Merck did eventually benefit. So a few months after launching this Mectazan donation program, it won a couple of awards from Business Week and Fortune for being the most admired company. And you might think, well, how does that award help? Well, this had a huge impact on the reputation of Merck. There had been many employees who wrote to Merck saying they chose Merck over another company, which might have offered a better financial package, just because they were inspired by the possibility of having a difference and making an impact on the world. And indeed, in most companies nowadays, it's human capital, which is the main asset. And if indeed the potential to serve a purpose enables you to have an advantage in recruiting scarce talent, that's something that helped Merck. And also you might think, well, that's shareholders who should complain about this because this free drug was coming out of shareholders' pockets. But the shareholders recognize that actually, well, in the long term, the reputational benefits, the motivational benefits may well come back to improve long-term shareholder value. And so they didn't actually receive any complaints even 10 years after the launch of this program. And if you look at how the company's performed since 1978, the average annual shareholder return has been 13%, which is about 50% higher than the S&P 500. Now, we obviously can't claim causation here. How do we know that the Mectazan donation program caused this higher return? Maybe Merck would have done even better had it not launched the program. But certainly that statistic is not at odds with the fact that actually purpose might be consistent with long-term shareholder returns rather than contradictory. Now, if you're skeptical, you might think, well, does this have anything to do with purpose? Because even if your only goal was maximizing shareholder value, maybe you would have thought that strategically, let me do this thing about launching this drug and making it freely available, and then I might benefit in the long term. But the problem with that is that's really difficult to calculate the long-term benefits of launching a program like this, right? It's really difficult to calculate how many or more employees you're going to motivate and attract. So instead, what Merck decided was, as I mentioned, our business is preserving and improving human life, and this is what drove them. And why I use this example is it's quite different from the coronavirus, right? The pandemic that we have right at the moment is really severe, and everybody knows there's pressure on a pharmaceuticals company to solve this problem. And it's a problem which affects the developed world as well as the developing world. Whereas with river blindness, this is something there was no real impetus. There was no real pressure for pharmaceuticals companies to address that. It was something which affected some citizens, which maybe many people just forgot about. And yet Merck thought that their role was not problem solving. It was not reacting to a big public health crisis that everybody wanted the industry to solve. It was problem finding. Let's think about what are the problems that we can go out and solve, even if there is not public pressure to solve them. And so before I hand back, so this is what I refer to my book as the pie growing mentality. Right, so we often think about the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And we think a responsible company is one that splits the pie fairly to make sure that not too much goes to investors in the form of profits, enough goes to stakeholders. And there are ways that you can do that. You can make sure you give money to charity. You can pay your workers more than you need to. You can make sure you pay fair tax rather than reducing tax to the minimum legally possible. All of those things are really important, and I absolutely do not want to dismiss them. But what I want to do is to change our thinking about responsible business to say it's more about growing the pie. So we absolutely do want to increase the orange, create more value for society. But the way we do that is not by giving them a greater share of what's already there, so throwing money at a problem by donating to charity or giving more in terms of taxes, but through innovation, through problem finding, through some crazy ideas, such as can we use this livestock drug to address river blindness? And it's through these ways of innovation that not only do we create value for society, but also companies can be ultimately more profitable because that innovation, even if solving a social problem was the main reason for doing it, ultimately might end up benefiting. So I would call a purposeful business as one that creates profits only through creating value for society. So absolutely the final 4 words is really important, right? We do want to create value for society, but the important thing to note is this is not unrealistic and the expense of profits, because if we start with the idea of let's try to use our expertise to solve social problems, if you do that successfully, then a company might ultimately be profitable. And therefore this trade-off that we think about between profit and purpose, while indeed it's not always resolved, that trade-off is not as stark as we often think when we realize that profit can be a byproduct of solving social problems. Yeah, well, thanks so much for the attention, and let me hand over to Andrew for the discussion part.
Thank you very much, Alex, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Alenka, for the introduction. You mentioned, or she mentioned, that Alex's book is on the best business books of 2020. One of my few powers at the Financial Times is to choose that list, so I was very happy to be able to recommend Alex's book, as I have been ever since it started coming out. I just want to remind the audience, there are some 170 of you on the call, that we'd like to take questions right from the beginning. So if you've already got things that you're burning to ask, please do post them into the Q&A box, and I will try and weave them into the conversation. Don't all wait till the last 5 minutes when there won't be time to address them. But for the first part of this, I'm going to try and pose some of my own questions. And I mean, leading on from that wonderful Merck example, which is obviously in the book as well, I suppose the question immediately arises of what pharmaceutical companies are doing today. They've got this huge opportunity with the vaccines that they've developed, the big bits of good news that have come through in the last few weeks. And although, as you mentioned, that is very clearly a developing country problem and therefore a profit-making opportunity for those companies, there is a low-income developing country issue as well, which is, you know, will they be able to distribute these? Will they want to distribute these drugs at cost, or possibly even, following a Merck example, at below cost? And what's the trade-off, I suppose, that they might have to make in thinking about the reputational advantages versus potentially the profit downsides of doing that? Have you given any thought to that, Alex? I'm just interested to know how that fits into your view of what purposeful pharmaceutical companies in particular should be doing in this pandemic.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. It's a very difficult dilemma. So on the one hand, we'd like to say, well, these pharmaceutical companies should do the right thing and make it available at cost throughout the world. But then there is this commercial reality of developing new drugs is really expensive. So there was one study which found that the average cost of developing and getting approval for a new drug is $3 billion. So without the profits from prior drugs, you won't be able to put the investment into launching new ones. But I think what is interesting here compared to the case of river blindness is because this is a developed as well as developing country issue, it affects the whole world, there might be some two-tier strategy which is possible, which might be to sell it at cost to developing countries where access is really a challenge, but then on the other hand to sell it at some reasonable profit to developed countries, because they're ones where governments will be able to buy it at greater than cost. And I don't think people would begrudge that, because it is something which, if indeed this vaccine is working, is going to have a transformative effect. So I think that two-tier strategy would, number one, have the reputational benefits of ensuring that your goal is to serve human health rather than to make a profit. So that's why it should be at cost to around the world, but also recognize the commercial reality is that, yes, these drugs do need to generate a profit in order not just to give the money to shareholders, but because they need to keep investing in the future, because we don't know what the next challenge will be for which we need some pharmaceutical cure.
I mean, Chris Hawes has actually asked the question that I was going to ask off the back of the Merck example, which is why aren't there more examples like Merck? I mean, it's a great example, but as you said, it dates from the 1980s. And we have had some attempts by pharmaceutical companies to shade this differently for different drugs for different developing countries, I think notably with HIV/AIDS. But I just wondered if there were, why you think there aren't more examples, given that the Merck one is so striking and the apparent benefits so great to them.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good question. As I think there's two ways in which companies can serve society. One is by giving something for free and or at cost, and that's really beneficial in order to give impact. And that's not just pharmaceuticals companies. You can have, say, Unilever at the moment giving 100 million euros of food and sanitizer. But I think if you think the second way that we can think about how to serve society is through innovation, that is something where I think there are a lot of examples there. So even if you don't give the product for free, by developing this product, sometimes having some crazy ideas of launching something which you would have never thought possible, that can be something which serves society. So another example from the book is Vodafone, which decided to launch M-Pesa, a mobile money service, using expertise in telecoms. And again, this is an example of problem finding. We've got this expertise, and we recognize there's this issue of financial inclusion within Kenya, so let's deploy this. Now, it's true that that's something which is monetizable, where you need to pay a small fee to use the M-Pesa service. But the benefit has been still immense. People found that within 7 years, 200,000 households got lifted up by poverty. So while I'll say that there's not the same examples of giving something completely for free, there are indeed examples of being motivated by using expertise to solve social problems, not thinking about, is this something which is going to make me as much money as possible? Indeed, at the time that Vodafone launched M-Pesa, its strategy was to win spectrum license auctions in the West rather than develop solutions to developing country problems, yet they chose to do that, even though that wasn't part of the core strategy. So I do think there's more encouraging examples of this idea of innovation.
So let's just talk briefly about the pandemic and what effect it's had. Your book came out before the pandemic struck. Clearly, it's got some many timeless elements to it. But I'm wondering whether you think that the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic might be an obstacle or an accelerant for the kind of purposeful business decisions that you describe there. I mean, in particular, I'm thinking about the pressures that economic downturn imposes on businesses. It might push them back to being pie splitters, to thinking about the ways in which they can husband scarce resources, rather than taking these bigger, longer term decisions like Merck did in the 1980s. How does the pandemic, do you think, affect that kind of decision-making process?
So I'm viewing it as a glass half full perspective. So you're right. There are definitely some challenges, and there is this view that if the pandemic means that resources are really scarce, then won't companies just focus on their own survival rather than serving wider society? But that's why I like this pie growing idea, because if we think about responsibility as splitting the pie differently, that is difficult in a pandemic, because there's some companies which just don't have pie to split. They just don't have money to be able to invest it in certain initiatives. But if you think about the responsibility as growing the pie as innovation, that's something which often just doesn't cost you a lot, but it's more the mindset of problem finding and redeploying your expertise. For example, Mercedes, so they make their expertise is precision engineering. It's normally used for Formula One engines and pistons, but that's not really helping right now. But what they chose to do is to redeploy that expertise to make CPAP breathing machines, which is a less invasive alternative to ventilators. And the same precision you need for a Formula One engine, you need to make sure that is really right for a breathing machine. And because what they had was already the expertise and the human capital, they didn't really need to hire anybody new. it was not really costing them much in order to come up with reverse engineering the design. And actually, it probably improved employee motivation because these precision engineers were able to use their talents to solve problems rather than sitting idle. So I think often it's just sort of the mindset, not always thinking about, oh, it's a problem of throwing money at an issue, which indeed is challenging because money is tight, but redeploying what you currently have and to think about how we can use that to social problems. And I think that is something which is empowered. And so obviously the pandemic's been really, really bad, but if there's a small silver lining from the pandemic, it's how we should rethink the notion of responsibility as a way of not necessarily splitting the pie and donating money, which we can't do in the pandemic, but thinking as a company, what is in my hand? Right, what is the unique resources and expertise that we have at our disposal, and how can we think creatively about using them to serve wider society? And there's been some great examples of these pandemic pivots where companies have redeployed their expertise to solve the problems that we have right now.
Richard Sturdy asks, I mean, to what extent do we think that ESG factors for investors will continue to be important despite or because of COVID-19? And if I can expand on that, I mean, clearly ESG, particularly in the US this last couple of years, has become a sort of enormously important investment strategy. Investors are interested in what companies are doing in environmental, social, and governance areas. I mean, again, does it strike you as something that will continue to be important, or is it in fact distorting to some degree the decisions that companies and investors are making by pushing them into thinking, putting these decisions into particular boxes, often, and frankly, to make sure that companies stay in indices which others will invest in? I mean, have we got the cart before the horse here on ESG?
Yes, I fear that we might have the cart before the horse. So it is something which I think will continue to be important. And we already had this big trend towards ESG even before the pandemic. So the pandemic has certainly accelerated it. But even when things go back to normal, I think the emphasis on ESG will just only continue because it was a trend that started beforehand. But is this a good trend or a bad trend? One might think because I'm an advocate of responsible business, I should be happy with this. But my concern is that these ESG metrics may not capture what I truly think purpose and responsibilities is about. So many of these metrics are on the do no harm aspect of responsibility. So this is make sure that you split the pie fairly, ensure that we don't emit too much carbon or use too much water, or we don't have too much of a CEO to employee pay gap. But obviously, again, those things are important. We do care about the division of the pie. But I believe that the main responsible action that a company can undertake is to grow the pie, is to actively innovate. And that effect is often not captured in standard ESG metrics. Indeed, sometimes it might harm them. So I serve on the Responsible Investment Advisory Committee of Royal London Asset Management. And one of the things we recently used is there's this new MSCI warming tool, which can evaluate your portfolio and figure out which stocks are contributing most towards global warming, which is obviously something everybody here really cares about. But what we found was that the worst stocks were semiconductors. Why? Because the manufacture of semiconductors releases perfluorocarbons, and that contributes even more to global warming than carbon dioxide emissions. However, semiconductors have a huge amount of good that they do in the world. They may well power the solutions to global warming. And beyond that, right, if you have microchips or if you have smartphones in developing countries, you can really transform people's lives. So smartphones are what allow people to access things such as M-Pesa rather than relying on cash where there's a huge risk of robbery and forgery. So I think if these ESG metrics focus too much on the do no harm aspect, rather than the actively do good aspect, you might have some investors who are pressured into divesting from semiconductor companies despite all the good that they're doing. So what I think we should try to look at is to look at this holistic perspective of not only the harm that a company does, but also the value that it generates. Now, there are indeed some initiatives to look at this positive aspect. There's one called impact weighted accounts from which some people at Harvard are developing. But the problem is that those metrics are not very comparable across different companies, because different companies create value to society in different ways. Some it's through telecoms, others it might be through financial inclusion, whereas the current ESG metrics of carbon emissions is something that every company can report. So I think what this requires is for investors and maybe society in general, because we obviously evaluate companies by who we choose to buy from, to recognize that there will not be some one size fits all universal metrics. Instead, how a company creates value for society will be specific to its own purpose and industry.
Let me just ask before we get more deeply into lots of questions that are coming in from the audience. I mean, just relating this to low-income countries and the areas where the Institute has particular interest in what purposeful business can do. I mean, in ESG terms, obviously there are companies that are less far advanced, perhaps in some areas of governance and environmental improvement, but which desperately need the support of investors in order to make those steps. I mean, where does an ESG lens, or indeed a purpose lens, fit into how companies in those developing economies improve from what might be initially quite a low base on those measures?
Yeah, this is a really important question that we try to wrestle with at Royal London, because we're a global fund and we want to invest in developing countries. And there we need to, what we're trying to do is not impose sort of UK standards on foreign companies, because what we look at is for a company to be best in class compared to its peer group, even if that might not be something we'd look at from a Western standpoint. For example, in terms of governance, right, one thing that I write a lot about is the importance of linking pay to long-term performance, but in just other countries you just don't have the culture of equity ownership among management. You typically will have more cash salaries and intrinsic incentives there, so it would be I think foolish to require companies to adopt what we'd see as a Western executive pay model. So there, what we ask for is not harmony within the West in terms of the actual reality of how your governance structure is or how your pay structure is, but just in terms of disclosure. So in developing countries, it may be that you're not forced to disclose executive pay. Some regimes only require you to disclose for it aggregate across the top management team. But we would say, well, even if you might not have similar contracts to what we do in the West, you can still at least disclose them. And so it's more this transparency that we care about, even though we don't actually require the content of those disclosures to be what we'd have in the UK or the US.
Right.
I think relatedly, we also don't want to have a third world standard on, so a developed country standard on the EMBS when we're looking at emerging countries. Why maybe an equivalent of McDonald's in the UK, we might say, well, that's not creating a lot of value for society, because it's one where maybe the quality of the food is not that high in terms of nutrition. But in a developing country where maybe it's a luxury to be able to take your family out for a meal, then maybe a restaurant which is not so expensive, that can add a lot of value there. So we need to recognize that the challenges that other countries face are different from the challenges that we face here.
Right. Zoe McLeod from the charity Sustainability First has a question. She says they're currently running a project called Fair for the Future, which works with essential service companies from water, gas, electricity, telecom sectors, looking at purposeful business. What can be done, she asked, to incentivize more purposeful companies, for example, through regulatory frameworks and government policy, which, as you've hinted in that last answer, is clearly probably looms larger actually in low-income developing economies, where the government perhaps has more remit across business.
Yeah, so I'll answer this from the government perspective. So what I've highlighted in the discussion so far is I do think businesses have a large role to play in addressing these problems, because businesses are innovative in the way that Merck or Mercedes have done. But that doesn't mean that I'm a complete free marketer who believes there's no role for government. I believe there is a strong role for government, but this role is to ensure that markets work better, because there's a lot of examples where there's market failure. So one way in which which I think government can help is to ensure that there's property rights, because without property rights, it's very difficult for outside investors to have shares in a company, because they could be losing through related party transactions and tunneling and the like. So strong property rights is something where there's some cross-country studies show that that's really strongly correlated with economic development. Another would be to ensure competition, because one of the forces which push companies towards being responsible is that if a company's not, then employees and customers can walk away. But that's something where you don't have that option if there isn't competition. So anything they can do to ensure that there is competition, for example, reducing the power of large monopolies, making sure that they don't form through mergers, and maybe on the other hand, funding small businesses, I think is very beneficial. And finally, to address externalities. So if there are indeed things that companies do which destroy value for society, such as bad work, poor working conditions, or child labor, or modern slavery. These are things where, rather than leaving it to market, those are things that just can be regulated out. So there are certain things where there are minimum standards that if a government doesn't uphold them, there could be a race to the bottom where certain companies will try to cut corners, and because they can do that, they're able to make short-term profits and maybe drive more purposeful companies out of business. So I'd say these externalities here are also examples of market failure where government should step in.
Right. Take another question here from Namaksabisu Majokweni, who's asked, he says he's more interested, sorry, he or she, I'm afraid I don't know the gender, I'm more interested in real economic empowerment examples of purposeful businesses as against the pure social investments like the Merck one. Do you have any such examples? For example, big corporate implementing preferential procurement plans to smaller enterprises, or other ways of developing smaller enterprises so they can be mainstreamed into significant businesses. And I guess this goes to a wider question of that the awful word that's always used is ecosystem, but the wider network of businesses in a supply chain that gets to be kind of improved and brought forward by a larger business at the center. So any other real economic empowerment examples for Namaksabisu?
Yeah, I think this idea of procurement that you mentioned is extremely powerful. So within the UK, in the FTSE 100, the average CSR spend of a company is £10 million. The average procurement budget is £4 billion. So that is 400 times what you spend on CSR. So just that this highlights how much power there is in terms of your procurement budgets. I know that some companies are taking this really, really seriously. And the advantage of this is several fold. So one of the things I'm really about is responsible investing. And I think that through our role as investors, we have a lot of power to put our money in what we would like to see in the world. But the problem with responsible investing is that you can only invest in publicly traded companies as a standard mutual fund and so on. Whereas if you're a company with a procurement budget, you can deploy that procurement budget to any supplier, be this public or private. So there's additional power to have some transformative effect in this. I know this a bit more within the UK rather than in the developing world, but there are some initiatives such as the Buy Social Corporate Challenge, which some companies sign up to, which try to ensure that that they're supporting these small businesses with a big mission. So one example I know is PwC. They buy their toiletries, which are used in say the bathrooms, from the soap company, which is the company which employs partially sighted citizens and other citizens who might not normally find employment. And this not only really helps that company and the citizens thus employed, but every time a PwC employee goes to the bathroom and is reminded of this is a company which supports some citizens in a really important model, that's something which helps them, I think, in terms of engagement. So even though that wasn't sort of the calculation or instrumental reason for doing it, it's another example of how an action taking to serve wider society can ultimately help the company's long-term performance as well.
So here's a question that goes to the heart of something that we think a lot about, and possibly this is a developed country obsession more than a developing country one. But Alan Giles asks, is the logical consequence of your thesis that remuneration committees should refocus executive pay plans to be measured solely on creating value for society, or is there still scope, in your view, for a more direct linkage to to the creation of shareholder value?
Thanks very much, Alan. I think I would still stay with the shareholder value model. So why is that? It's just very difficult to measure social value. So there's multiple different aspects. So it could be the number of people that you provide financial inclusion to if you're Vodafone. There's the carbon footprint, gender diversity, lots of these different dimensions. And the problem is that if you were to try to link pay to some of them, you have this concern of hitting the target and missing the point. For example, we could recruit particular people to the board or the senior management team who are ethnic minorities or females, but not be concerned about a diversity of thinking or a culture that encourages psychological safety and all of these other aspects. And it may be that people tick the box in terms of gender or ethnic diversity, but actually don't have a diversity in terms of skills. So certainly companies should be measuring those things. But I think when you link pay to that, there's a lot of potential unintended consequences. And there's evidence finding that in other fields. For example, if you pay teachers according to test scores, they start teaching to the test. But what I think is valuable about the shareholder pay model is that there's a lot of evidence showing that in the long term, very many of these measures of social value end up improving shareholder value. So the Merck was one example, it was one anecdote, but there's a lot of more rigorous research showing that that's more systematic, is that when companies serve wider society, ultimately shareholder value improves. And there's a very nice study done by Caroline Flammer and Tima Bansal, which looks at what happens when a company chooses to tie pay more to long-term shareholder value. What do you think happens to profitability? It drops, but it only drops in the short term. It actually rises in the long term. But what else rises is innovation rises. So if we think about that being the main way in which a company serves society, they're producing more patents and the patents are better, but also measures of stakeholder value go up, the value that you create to the environment, communities, and in particular employees. So what that suggests is the best way to improve stakeholder value is not to have explicit stakeholder metrics, because then the CEO might pursue only those metrics being rewarded, but instead when her pay is tied to the long term, she knows now that she's actually free from having to meet quarterly earnings targets, and indeed can just focus on creating value for society. And somebody asked earlier about what are the barriers to putting this into practice, and I responded by talking about the government's role. But I think one of the barriers is indeed just the focus on short-term financial targets. And if indeed a CEO is free to think about the long term, then she's able to make these long-term investments, which ultimately improve shareholder value, as we've discussed.
But I mean, as you've touched on in the answer to a few questions, I mean, I picture the case being made for this social value and the long-term benefits, and obviously some of the precedents that you've mentioned tackle this. But you know, the hard-headed CFO and CEO, particularly in difficult times like we're now entering, are they not going to say, "Show me the data"? I mean, I'm a strong believer that not everything that needs to be managed can be measured, but often the hard data overrides either the long-term or the unmeasurable or difficult to measure parts of this. I mean, how would you make the case to a board that these long-term benefits need to be taken into account?
Thanks. Well, this is why I come to this question as an academic, because you might think, well, why do I as a finance professor want to care about responsibility? Because often finance people are these hard-headed businessmen and businesswomen who want to see the bottom line impact. But this is what the research that I and other academics have been doing for the last 15 and 20 years, is to show that Merck is not one hand-picked convenient example, but to look at rigorous research showing what is the long-term impact of treating society well and investing in stakeholders, and also trying to distinguish correlation from causation, because you might think, is it purpose that leads to profit? Or maybe the opposite, only once a company is already profitable can it indeed think about purpose. And there's indeed evidence suggesting it's the former. So there is a business case for investing in stakeholders, not just a moral and an ethical case. Now, you still might think, well, that is something which is only in the long term. So while the idea of growing the pie seems attractive, only in the long term does investing in stakeholders pay off. What about in the short term, when indeed you've got quarterly earnings targets to hit and maybe dividends to be paid? But this goes to, again, the idea of trying to report on some of these outcomes that you're having beyond just financial value. So if a company is able to say, yes, we're not hitting maybe our quarterly earnings targets, but that's because we're engaging in these initiatives to solve these particular social problems, then that's something that investors might be willing to accommodate. And again, I don't think this is wishful thinking in my part. When Kraft made the takeover bid for Unilever, what often happens in a situation like that is it's the company which then defends itself and tries to persuade shareholders not to accept the bid. But surprisingly here, it's the shareholders who came out and defended Unilever. And they said, we know what the true value of the business is. The true value is the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which we believe will create a lot of long-term value, which is not captured in Kraft's bid. And because Unilever had invested a lot in terms of reporting the impact of this initiative, then even though there was an attractive 20% immediate takeover premium had the shareholders accepted, they chose to turn that down because they recognized that the long-term value of the business was beyond that. So going back to your point, Andrew, about the ecosystem here, like what's important is not only for a CEO to be enlightened, but to make sure that she also has shareholder buy-in, because if so, that will give her even more freedom to think about long-term rather than the need to hit these short-term measures.
Right. Julian Marins from London Business School asks, given that you advocate for growing the pie, how do you reconcile this idea with looming concerns regarding climate change and overuse of resources? So he says he understands that technology is often cited as a possibility to grow the pie without exhausting the planet, but is this feasible in the short run, he adds? I guess we're talking about the long run really here, but what do you think?
Thanks very much, Julian, for the question. And I think I do think it's feasible because I have a different notion of the pie. So some people often view the pie as financial wealth. And if so, we can't really grow it too much because we might exceed some planetary boundaries. But importantly here, the pie is social value. So financial wealth is only one part of that. It was only the blue, right? The orange was societal value, including what would be called natural capital. So I think I'd like to have a different view as to what wealth or capital is. It's not just financial capital, but human capital, social capital, and natural capital. And indeed, what I would see as growing the pie would involve is contributing towards you say, which will be powering some of the solutions to climate change, ways of indeed making production with less use of resources or less emissions. So I would see that as being part of growth. And so growing the pie is absolutely not just growing the blue, the profits, but thinking about how we can solve social problems. Yes, profits are important, but I see profits as a byproduct of solving social problems. And one of these problems is indeed climate change. So what a company should be motivated to do is to address those issues of natural capital rather than just focusing on financial capital.
Right. I'll throw in a couple more questions before we run out of time. But Jay Bansols asked two questions, but I'll pick the one that relates to vaccines because interestingly, he talks about COVAX and organizations like the WHO and Gavi, which are trying to secure COVID vaccines for developing nations. Is their funding structure a sustainable method of tackling pandemics? And I might that's a big question to answer, but I might throw in there, the cooperation there with businesses, back to the issue of how do you get the vaccines out to developing nations. Those sorts of combinations where you've got public, private, and charitable or donation-based organizations working together. I mean, how strong a structure is that if you're trying to do something on this global scale?
Yeah, so I'm sorry that you chose one question where I don't have specific expertise on those specific funding models. But what I can say is that what is great is there's been a lot of experimentation, not only in terms of innovation of finding new drugs, but innovation in ways to fund research. And there's some really good academic research which tries to look at what funding structures might be the most effective. So typically, we funded research by funding the input into research. So like as a professor, you get a research grant, and that's something where you put it towards research. That's the same with companies. They get research grants to fund the input. But instead, what some new measures look at is to fund the output of research, which is if indeed your research is successful, then there is indeed some subsidy towards that, and that makes sure that it's only successful research that pays off. So one thing that I've put on my book's website is, which is growthepie.net/blog, is that any new paper which has come out since I published the book, which is relevant for some of the themes of the book, I try to summarize for a general audience. And there's indeed a really nice new paper by Michael Kramer, who just won last year's Nobel Prize in Economics, looking at a drug development scheme, which is an output-based one, and finding that it was a way of actually encouraging some drug development there. So I won't go through all of the details of that scheme just because there's more questions, but I just encourage you to take a look at that paper, which tries to look at some new models. So sorry to not answer that specific question. It's just something I don't have specific knowledge of. But what I would say is there's a lot of research on different types of ways of funding. And so that's one of the ways that the blog of the book's website is trying to contribute, is to make some descriptions of those other funding models.
A shorter one, and perhaps a simpler one in some respects. Subhadra Kunduri writes, how is corporate purpose different from corporate shared value? Corporate shared value is something I wrote about 10 years ago, about the first column I wrote about management and dealing with the sort of Friedmanite conundrum. Are we talking about two different things? I might even throw in sustainability and indeed CSR, corporate social responsibility. These just all tend to get mixed together into the same bucket.
Yeah, it's another good question. And there's a lot of alignment between purpose and CSR, sustainability and shared value. I'd say there's a couple of things which are different. So specifically with sustainability, so sustainability only means long term. And so you could be a company that maximizes shareholder value only, and you could be said to be sustainable because as long as we think about long-term shareholder value, that will still cause us to treat our employees well and to solve some social problems and so on. So why I think what I'm proposing is different from long-term shareholder value is that the motivation is intrinsic rather than instrumental. We could maximize long-term shareholder value by treating our employees well, but only we would do that if we could calculate that there is going to be some future benefit. Whereas the examples that I've given of Merck and Vodafone, those were examples where you do this without a calculation. You do this because your purpose is to contribute towards human health. And then later on, unexpectedly, you get some benefit. With CSR, that is often seen to be something which is non-core. So that need not be linked to the core business. It could be you can have a tobacco company which donates a lot of profits in order to try to serve society. Whereas with purpose, I think this is inextricably linked to the core business, which is saying, well, how can you solve social problems through what you do as a core business? And indeed, some of the best things that companies do to serve society are not non-core CSR initiatives such as charitable donations, but using their expertise in wider ways, such as Mercedes or Vodafone or Merck. So I think the important thing about purpose is it's linked to your core expertise.
So we're nearly out of time. So I want to return to a challenge that Alenka laid down when she introduced us, which was not only to talk about the practices that work, and you've done a lot of that and mentioned some practical examples as well, but what can we do? And I suppose the we there is as individual citizens, might be us with our pension plans. What can we do to harness the power of purposeful business, or more importantly, perhaps to encourage purposeful business as individual consumers, citizens, shareholders, possibly business people ourselves?
I think it's a great thing to end on. And I think the point to highlight is that as citizens, we probably have more power now to affect companies than we did in the past. And you might think, well, that's bizarre because now companies are massive. How can we as an individual person have any impact? But indeed, as you're saying, Andrew, through your purchasing behavior, through who you invest in, through even as an employee speaking up. So one example I have is Abdul Durant, who was a cleaner at HSBC. He actually got up at the annual meeting and said, said, I'm having to work on £5 an hour, I can't even afford to send my children to school because they can't afford the books. And that actually led to the chairman giving a 23% pay rise to the cleaners. Nowadays, if a company is non-purposeful, the power that we have through customer boycotts can spread hugely. So this is not to say that we should always boycott or start some Twitter storm, but this is to say that we have the power to put our money into companies that reflect what we'd like to see in the world through things such as our investment decisions and our customer decisions. And also we have tools and information to support us. So there's apps such as Boycott or Good for You, where if you were to scan a barcode, then this tells you whether it aligns with your values. So you pre-specify the values that you care about, and you can get information about that. And I don't think it's unrealistic for customers to think that they're going to base their choices on those decisions, because we already are willing to pay more for organic food or locally sourced food. Indeed, now customers are willing to pay more for products that accord with their values. And I could just do a plug. Tom Gosling and I just recorded a podcast at LBS on this, which is called How Can Citizens Make a Difference? Specifically on your point, Andrew, is that it doesn't require you to be the CEO of a company like Roy Vagelos and think, oh yeah, let's give the drug for free. I think ordinary citizens can do this by our role as customers, investors, and also employees.
But if there are any CEOs of multinationals on the call, please take Roy Vagelos' example to heart. Alex, thanks very much for chatting about this. I'm going to hand back to Alenka. Thank you for all your questions that many of which I've had to leave unanswered. But thank you also, Alex, for your insights. Alenka, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for your excellent presentations and an engaging discussion. So what I wanted to do is just to highlight a few things. So overall, you agreed a lot, right? You agreed about the need to grow rather than divide the pie, escaping the trade-off between purpose on one hand and then shareholder value on the other hand. And Alex talked a lot about identifying these really nice instances in which firms and their managers can create long-term profits while also catering to stakeholders' interest. So for example, by generating intangible long-term benefits like Merck did in terms of reputational benefits associated with developing a free drug for river blindness. So these are those amazing instances we want to think about and we want to take away from this conversation as where the two kind of meet, and so growing the pie is possible. So clearly one takeaway from today, I thought, is that firms really can and should formulate strategies for advancing both, right? Thinking about shareholder and stakeholder value, because as some would argue, well, not all profit is equal and some businesses produce more positive externalities than others. And so what we heard today is that firms can sometimes do better than governments in creating social value and growing the pie. So many businesses like Merck are global players, and that means that they can internalize negative externalities more. Or maybe Alex was talking about how they have more resources to create value, and they're just better at it than government or NGOs. We also talked about how firms could be better at opening new markets, serving unmet needs in undeserved communities or underserved communities, come up with new marketing or distribution methods, and really acting as social entrepreneurs in lower income countries. And so I think this is especially true now in the times of global pandemics. And we talked about how biotech and pharma are at the forefront of addressing the current crisis. So in conclusion, growing the pie is no longer debated, I think, but what becomes apparent now, I think, is that, well, the biggest challenge is how do we do it? What are the best ways to proceed to grow rather than divide? And so we talked about what metrics to use, how to measure social value, how to incentivize startups, but also large incumbents to innovate, to create social value, to be those social entrepreneurs. And what's the role of regulation in all of that? Do we want more or less regulation in supporting purposeful businesses, because as we heard today, the best practices are actually not always clear. And so here's where Andrew and Alex, I think, have given us an incredible intellectual apparatus to think more about these complex and really difficult issues. So no doubt we live in very interesting but also challenging times. And so solutions may not always be as clear as we would want them to be, but most importantly, we as citizens or investors have a role to play. And so we're extremely grateful for your insights today. I think you left us with a lot to think about. And so thanks to everyone for joining the webinar today. So thank you very much again, and have a great afternoon and stay safe.